2000s, a webcomic was born from the mind of a creator. This webcomic was unlike anything that had come before or after it. It was a webcomic that would fundamentally change the internet forever, and it all started with a young, 13-year-old boy sitting in his room who had yet to be given a name. But while this webcomic is known to people far and wide, the history of this webcomic was never all sunshines and rainbows. It had its fair share of unruly fans, drama and controversies, which, quite frankly, is par for the course for something of this magnitude, but it always seemed to come out on top. But now, I'd say that the current future of this webcomic is, at the time of writing this, a little uncertain. But how can something that was so prolific come to a point like this, where it is a mere shadow of its former self? Well, I'm here to resolve that mystery for you, so allocate your Strike Specubus and equip your Silodex, and let me tell you about Homestuck. Homestuck was created on the 13th of April 2009 by one Andrew Hussey. It was the fourth in the series of his aptly titled MS Paint adventures, coming off the back of his previous adventure, Problem Sleuth, which had gained a cult following during the course of its run and was arguably Hussey's biggest claim to fame and a project that laid the foundation for all of his work to be put into the spotlight. All of his work was eventually hosted on a site named after the series, which was where Homestuck found its footing, and what would be its home for almost a decade before the comic's acquisition in late 2017 by Viz Media, where it was then relocated to a site of Viz Media's own creation, which focused solely on Homestuck and media related to it. Homestuck's format, like Hussey's other work, was styled in the form of text-based adventures, being an homage to games of that ilk. The initial plot of Homestuck revolves around the aforementioned 13-year-old boy, who is revealed to be named John Egbert. Together with his three friends Dave Schreider, Rose Lalonde, and Jade Harley, he prepares to play the hotly anticipated, newly released game Suburb. Unbeknownst to them all, by playing the game, they have inadvertently brought about the apocalypse, and only narrowly avoid being consumed by the end of the world themselves by entering the game, which turns out to be entering in a literal sense, as they get transported onto their own unique planets within the game world upon entering. They all play Suburb together with the ultimate goal of beating the game and receiving their ultimate prize, which is revealed to be a brand new universe over the course of the comic. As with Jailbreak and Problem Sleuth before, Homestuck started out having its plot mainly propelled through user submissions. Fans would create suggestions for the actions the characters would take and submit them into a suggestion box on the website, from which Hussey would choose one of them to draw. Whilst this led to some pretty nonsensical things happening during the early pages of the comic, this was very quickly phased out in favour of Hussey taking the reins himself, as he felt that the fan submission route had become, quote, too unwieldy and made it difficult to tell a coherent story, due to the quickly increasing popularity of the comic. And oh man, did it ever grow popular. Homestuck exploded in popularity, mainly due to its interesting characters, off-the-wall, sometimes shitpost level humour, and its frequent use of animated GIFs, animations, short adventure games, and its large quantity of quality music, a good portion of which was composed by a dude you probably never heard of, Toby Fox. At the time, for a webcomic to use this many avenues to tell its story, it was practically unheard of, which only brought more people into its fold. Another one of its strengths was that, during a majority of its run, Homestuck updated at a breakneck pace, with roughly 2 new pages being uploaded every single day, with the exception usually being when Hussey was working on a flash animation. With multiple methods of telling its increasingly complex, yet interesting story, and a steady stream of content keeping its readers appeased, Homestuck had everything that seemed to be necessary in order for it to be a massive success. It had the makings of something destined for greatness, and it was definitely managed to live up to that greatness. However, I'd argue that there was something that contributed even more to Homestuck's popularity, something that became fundamentally synonymous with Homestuck and its fans. Trolls. Once the main four start to get acquainted with the game, trolls were thrown into the story through some correspondence with the main characters via chat logs, but didn't get a formal introduction until Act 5, Act 1 of Homestuck, where they were revealed to be an alien race from another universe, most commonly identified by their grey skin and horns. The planet they lived on, Alternia, was a far cry from the world that we're used to, with survival of the fittest being one of the planet's biggest values. Violence was seen as the norm on Alternia, with trolls constantly killing each other, friendship being seen as a weakness, disabled trolls being liable to be killed on account of their disability, and a hierarchy being enforced where trolls are higher on the social ladder based on their blood colour. Huh. Okay, so maybe it's not so different from our world, but the point I'm trying to make is that it was a brand new world with a brand new race that had a completely different way of life to us, and the Homestuck community was blessed with 12 characters from this world, one for each of the signs of the zodiac, all with their own unique personalities that breathed life into them, for better or for worse. The stage was set, the land tilled, and the fanfiction was ready to be written, and the fanbase took full advantage of it. I don't think it's unfair of me to say that in the early 2010s, seeing a person wandering around in grey body paint and candy coloured horns was practically inescapable. Homestuck was at an all-time high during this period, and the fandom had never been so rich and filled with life. But with every high comes lows, and Homestuck was definitely heading towards it. But before I get into that though, let's touch on a little something first. Let's talk about the Kickstarter. On the 4th of September 2012, Hussey announced the Kickstarter for Homestuck adventure game, a project that would later come to be known as HypeSwap. In order to make the game, Hussey asked for $700,000. Not only did the Kickstarter manage to raise $250,000 in a few hours, it hit the target goal in less than a day and a half after the Kickstarter launched. And by the time the Kickstarter ended on the 4th of October, the Kickstarter had managed to amass almost $2.5 million, more than 3 times the initial target, which made it one of the few Kickstarters to pull in more than 7 figures, as well as being one of the highest funded video games in the entire site's history at the time. However, this was only at the time, and other Kickstarters have usurped this title from Hussey's Kickstarter and raised more money since, for better and for worse. In late 2013, the game was slated for a June 2014 release. When June 2014 came around, Hussey announced that the game would be developed by The Odd Gentleman, notable for their work developing/reviving King's Quest, a series of adventure games originally created by Sierra in 1984. However, on October 30th of that same year, Hussey made a dev update post essentially saying that the official title of the game was HypeSwap, as I mentioned, and that The Odd Gentleman had been quietly let go from the project, with development of the game being moved in-house to What Pumpkin Studios. Interesting. Several months pass, with the occasional update being given via concept art or showcasing some 3D models for the game, but on the 10th of April 2015, a teaser trailer was released for HypeSwap on What Pumpkin Studios' YouTube account, and it was very not good. On top of having a general lack of polish, the trailer suffered from horrible frame rate issues, but that's okay because after all, it was still something. Progress was still being made, right? Well, a few months later, on the 26th of December, it was announced that HypeSwap was no longer going to be made in its current state and was switching over to a 2D format. And that's about it. No other official updates were given on HypeSwap until October of 2016, where a new trailer featuring the 2D art style was launched, as well as an announcement for a release date of January 2017. Despite this, on the 26th of January 2017, Hussey posted an update stating that the deadline had been missed, and that the game had been delayed yet again for an unspecified amount of weeks on the grounds that the game was just about done, and that it could still use some more testing to be absolutely certain we are not releasing a buggy piece of shit. HypeSwap went on to release another trailer in April and get delayed yet again before finally being released in September, 5 years after its Kickstarter, to positive reviews. Now, why did I go through the effort of telling you all this? Well, I'm going to refer back to this little story of development hell later on in the video, so make sure to keep note of this, alright? Now then, let's talk about the latter half of Homestuck and the future beyond. While Homestuck could update at near supersonic speeds, that isn't to say they didn't have its fair share of hiatuses. While most of these were fairly minor, there were 2 big ones that really changed the shape of Homestuck's community: the Gigapause and the Omegapause. The Gigapause and the Omegapause were 2 massive hiatuses, with the Gigapause lasting a full year from the 16th of October 2013 to the 16th of October the following year, and the Omegapause lasting from the 28th of July 2015 to March 28th 2016. The main reason for the large hiatuses was to finish up a large amount of work for the remainder of the comic, as well as its conclusion, which was initially intended to be released in large, bulky updates. These were the longest periods of time that the Homestuck community had ever had to deal with such a drought of content, something that was completely jarring in comparison to the near constant flow of content that they had been getting for the better part of 4 years at this point. It was a shock to a lot of people's systems, and a lot of people did what you usually do when you're no longer getting content from a series that you once enjoyed. You move on. The Homestuck community saw a lot of people reintegrating themselves into new fandoms, mostly due in part to the hiatuses, but also because quite a few people voiced their displeasure with Act 6 of the comic, citing the large focus on unnecessary teen drama as their main reason for losing interest. Homestuck wouldn't really see a large resurgence in fan interactions until the 6th of April 2016, when Collide was released, which was an 18-minute long animation depicting the final battle of the webcomic, as well as Act 7, which serves as the conclusion for the main comic, released 7 years to the day of Homestuck's creation, 13th of April 2016. And that was it. Homestuck was done. Whilst it was nowhere near prolific as its glory days, and the Homestuck craze had all but died out by this point, it had a good run. It still had a dedicated fan base, and the amount of fan-produced content littered around the internet all but stood as a testament to how much it had impacted people's lives, and the legacy it had left behind. For all the Homestuck community had endured, it seemed that Homestuck had ended on a high note. However, little did anyone know, just 3 years later, something would rear its head that would leave the fanbase divided. After 3 years of semi-dormancy, Homestuck would see a revival in the form of the Homestuck Epilogues, released on Homestuck's 10-year anniversary. This was quickly followed by Homestuck 2, or Homestuck Squared, whichever you prefer, which was released in October 2019. The fan reaction to both of these new installments in the Homestuck franchise were mixed, to say the least. While many enjoyed the epilogues, stating that they liked the idea of there being more to the story beyond the happily ever after, as well as how the epilogues and to an extent Homestuck 2 portrayed the reality of growing up and realizing that the world isn't as rigid and as black and white as we've all been led to believe, a lot of people harshly criticized them too, stating that they ruined a perfectly good ending, replacing it with additional content that just seemingly serves as a means to tear down the conclusion we were given, and replaced it with a horribly bleak slog of a mess that spits in the face of people who wanted and were perfectly content with a happy ending. It also doesn't help that the people who were dissatisfied with the Homestuck epilogues got a double dose of disappointment when it was revealed that Homestuck 2 was going to be directly based off of the epilogues and pretty much serve as a direct continuation of them, despite members of the writing team previously saying that fans are free to dislike and disregard the epilogues as it is, and ultimately is it up to the reader to decide their own canon and after what happened at the end of Homestuck proper. Which means that now, the epilogues have become something necessary to understand in order to have context for the sequel. Speaking of sequels, Homestuck 2 came under fire for similar reasons, due to reasons that I've already touched on. Readers complained that Homestuck 2 felt nothing like the webcomic before it that had been running for the better part of a decade, and instead felt like it was a cheap fan attempt at recreating it, not to mention that everyone was a fan of the characterizations of the main cast, seeing as they retained them from the epilogues, which, as I've made clear many times now, was not to everyone's taste. People believed that the characters had just become exaggerated caricatures of themselves, and it just made an already difficult read for some into even more of a torturous journey, with people only subjecting themselves to it in order to see if it got any better. Furthermore, Homestuck 2 suffered from something that I felt the original comic also suffered from, a good old case of nothing fucking happens-itis. Homestuck 2 has horrible pacing, with nothing significant to the plot happening at all really, which sucks, because at the time of writing the script for this video, what is there seems to be suggesting that this is all just groundwork for a big conflict that will really get the ball rolling in terms of actual content, although I doubt this will really end up coming to fruition for a while, considering the comic itself probably won't be updated for a long time. More on that later. For now though, I think I'll address the elephant in the room. From what I've gleaned from my own observations, talking to people within the fandom, and reading through people's thoughts on the sequel, this is one of the biggest points of contention about it, and I feel like I can't talk about the sequel without mentioning it. So let's talk about the Rose Jade love child! Let me set the stage for those who aren't in the know. So throughout the course of Homestuck, two of the main characters, Rose and Kanaya, end up developing feelings for each other. After a few awkward moments and one drunken day, they end up becoming an official couple, and get married after the conclusion of the comic. In the epilogues, they also adopt and raise a troll that bears a striking resemblance to Vriska, another troll who they were allied with and mysteriously disappeared at the end of the comic. So keep in mind, not only had they been in a committed relationship for quite some time, they were also married and had started their own family. So when Homestuck 2 rolls around, it's revealed that, and I swear to God this is true, Rose cheated on her wife with Jade, who in discontinuity possesses a dog dick, which she impregnates Rose with. Rose then gives birth to her child, who she, along with Jade, raises in secret behind her wife's back for years. The name they gave to this child? Yiffy. Yes, the completely non-joking, unironic name of their child is Yiffany, Yiffy Longstocking Lalonde Harley. And the cherry on top? The reason that she does all of this? Because Jade was lonely and wanted a child of her own. That's it. So of course, when the update broke that released this info onto the world, it was widely derided as extremely poor, out of character writing, which did nothing but create artificial drama and tore a huge hole in a widely beloved ship for no real reason or benefit. As Homestuck 2 was a Patreon funded series, as time went on, the pledges people made to the comic began to dwindle, due to more and more people being unimpressed with what they had been given. Also probably due to some more drama, but the amount of drama in and around the Homestuck community is enough to be its own video entirely, so I think I'll skip over that for today. There also seemed to be some internal trouble with the Homestuck 2 team as well, with members of the team starting to drop like flies, with even Hussey himself leaving at one point. This all eventually led to its logical conclusion when in early February of 2021, the community noticed that not only had the Homestuck 2 Patreon been locked, but all of the Patreon exclusive content had been released to the public, something that the team had only said they would do if the project faced cancellation, which led to people assuming the worst. People also pointed out that a company that had been producing Homestuck 2 alongside the What Pumpkin team, Snake Solutions, which was at the time founded by a member of the writing team Aisha Yu Farah and a former member of the writing team Kate Mitchell, was also mysteriously shut down. So you may be wondering, Roots, what the hell happened? Well, we'll answer that question in just a bit, but first, remember earlier in the video where I talked about the travesty that was the Heir Swap Kickstarter? Let me go back to that for just another minute. On the 3rd of October 2020, a person who goes by the name of Geo posted an article to their blog about the entire Heir Swap saga. This is an extremely well put together, informative, comprehensive transcript of pretty much every last scrap of information they could possibly find about the whole debacle, and I'm going to leave a link in the description if you want to read this for yourself. Anyway, one notable detail it mentions, and one I intentionally left out, was in July of 2015, according to this article, IPGD, a friend of Hussey's, posted a lengthy post about what they had managed to uncover about the Kickstarter, and essentially accused the odd gentleman of stealing the funds. This post itself is extremely lengthy, so I will read some excerpts. I'm sure that everyone has noticed by now that the Homestuck game is very, very late. Boy, do I have a fun reason why! You may remember that What Pumpkin announced that the game studio, The Odd Gentleman, was originally attached to develop the game, and you may also remember that they quietly moved to in-house development in 2014. What they didn't tell you. The reason that they did this was that The Odd Gentleman stole Kickstarter money and spent it on King's Quest. I imagine most of us who backed the Homestuck game Kickstarter are pretty curious about what was going on there, so I've done some work on the comic and talked to Andrew from time to time, so I tried asking about what happened and got some very cagey non-responses. Eventually, he tells me he can't actually tell me anywhere but through Kickstarter because of a settlement he signed, already fishy. So I sent in an inquiry through Kickstarter, and what I got was a big steaming load of bullshit worse than anything I could have imagined. I'm talking multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. According to the timeline in the doc I got, What Pumpkin gave $788,000 to the Odd Gentleman in 2012 to develop Heir Swap. Then they proceeded to do next to nothing, completely blowing off the dev schedule that they agreed to. At some point, the Odd Gentleman apparently just completely gave up working on Heir Swap because they were tapped to develop King's Quest. However, instead of dropping out of developing the game, they just decided to just not tell What Pumpkin and proceed to spend the money they were given on King's Quest development instead. Eventually, after months of platitudes and refusals to communicate, at one point Andrew even moved across the country to be able to visit the Odd Gentleman's offices and get the ball rolling on development, but they wouldn't even let him come in. What Pumpkin realised that they'd have to drop the Odd Gentleman, so they terminated the contract in late 2014. It doesn't look like there was ever a point where the Odd Gentleman wasn't funneling Homestuck's Kickstarter money into another game. It's unclear whether they ever actually intended to seriously develop the game. They straight up signed up to steal money from us. I remember this post spreading like wildfire when I first heard about it. Hell, up until I found this article and started making this video, I, and most likely the rest of the community, was convinced that this whole thing regarding the Odd Gentleman was an open and shut case. They had stolen the money, made a mockery of Hussey and the community, and just ruined what had been a massive effort to create something that we all would have loved. Just disappointing all around. But what if I told you that it may not be all that simple? On the 14th of January 2021, Geo made a follow-up post to their Hive Swap post, detailing more information about the Odd Gentleman incident. On the 14th of January 2021, Geo made a follow-up post to their Hive Swap post, detailing more information about the Odd Gentleman incident, with a large amount of info they had gained from a credible source. Now, I feel like before I move forward with this, I need to preface this segment thusly. As detailed as this article is, most of the information comes from sources who allegedly cannot be named, due to the inherent mystery surrounding this whole debacle, which makes it very difficult to believe that the information contained within is credible. This then begs the question, well Root, so why did you include it in the first place then? And the answer to that is because if this is true, then it offers up an interesting insight into when, how and why things went wrong with the Hive Swap Kickstarter. Despite all that, I do have to stress that I urge you to read the articles yourself, which I will provide links to in the description, and come to your own conclusions and take the information that I'm about to grab from the article with a pinch of salt. So continuing on, the info from the credible source reveals that while parts of the IGPD post are true and do line up with the chronology of certain events as well as the events that were confirmed to have happened when more info was brought to light, the whole thing is potentially a distortion of the facts to absolve Hussey of any wrongdoing. Once again, this is a massive comprehensive article that I could barely do justice within the confines of this video, so I'll just be quoting some of its content to get the point across. The biggest reason that there's an NDA in place about the Odd Gentleman's involvement is that Andrew wanted to cover up the fact that much of the blame is on Andrew's failure to deliver a workable plan to the studio in the agreed upon schedule. What actually happened is this. Andrew and the Odd Gentleman committed to a development schedule that started with a design document that Andrew needed to write. However, he failed to produce that document on time, which wrecked the schedule. During this period, when the Odd Gentleman could not work on any specific of Hive Swap because Andrew wouldn't provide the requisite documents, Andrew had the Odd Gentleman work on general assets. At some point during that time, Andrew had the Odd Gentleman spend their budget, the Kickstarter funds, on making 3D animatics and animations for the Homestuck finale video, Act 7, instead of working on Hive Swap. Andrew justified this by saying that the properties were related and that the Act 7 assets would be used in Hive Swap. Significant portions of the Act 7 animation were in progress or finalized as early as 2013, the work all done in secret by the Odd Gentleman. Eventually, the Odd Gentleman decided they had wasted too much time making comic assets for Homestuck and needed to work on work that was on track to go forward, which Hive Swap was not. The problem was, when Andrew was ready for the Odd Gentleman to work on Hive Swap, he demanded it be worked on right away. At this point, the Odd Gentleman was on schedule to finish and deliver King's Quest and needed to finish that project first, but Andrew wouldn't have it. Now hold on, you say. These are pretty big accusations that this article, and by extension myself, may be making. Where's the hard, concrete evidence? And that's where you come into a problem because, well, there is none. There's no giant billboard saying Andrew absolutely did all of this shit, because there's only a small amount of people who could, and as Geo says in their own article, given the innate secrecy of the thing, there are only a handful of people in the world who could confirm or disprove this, and generally those people directly profit from that information not being shared at all. A statement which I leaned into early on in the video. However, there are things that are known, and Geo uses what is known in order to put together evidence and see what supports and refutes these claims. Once again, this is an exceedingly long section of the article, and I'll do my best to summarize some of it as best as possible. Let's start off with the IPGD post. In the post, they claim that they sent an inquiry to Andrew through Kickstarter, which to my understanding isn't even a thing that you can actually do. What most likely happened is that Andrew sent the information through DMs to IGPD, and given that this is most likely Hussey's own account of the events, it puts a big question mark on the validity of that information. After all, if the claims in the geopost are true, I don't think Hussey would be willing to be very forthcoming with information that exposes his incompetence and mishandling of hundreds of thousands of dollars that weren't even his to begin with and was placed into his hands in good faith, but I digress. While IGPD's comment about the odd gentleman being paid close to $800,000 to work on Hiveswap and were offered next to nothing in terms of a product are true, it fails to mention that they were allegedly bottlenecked by Hussey's failure to produce the design doc, as well as them working on other Homestuck related content at Hussey's direction. When it comes to accusations of the odd gentleman working on Act 7 in secret, this is where things get pretty interesting. Gio reached out to people who had definitely worked on Act 7, where it was learned that most of them were brought onto the project in exactly the manner you would have expected them to be were these claims truthful, which is that they were given an unfinished product with no explanation given as to its origin, and tasked with finishing it. One source even states how they were completely shut down when they tried to look into the origin of this unfinished animation. When I came onto the project, I was given very cagey answers about who had worked on it previously. I wasn't told their names even after asking, and I only recognised some of animation work because they're a friend. I asked if I could contact any of the people who were working on it before and was shut down on that front. This is just my impression from that time, but it came off as if there was some sort of not so amicable parting happening. Furthermore, a comment made by Hussey about Act 7 fits all too easily into the timeline of events involving what progress the odd gentleman made on the animation, as well as the eventual hiring of the team that would finish it. And despite Hussey's claims, as of Act 2 of Hiveswap, none of the assets from Act 7 have been used so far. Once again, I definitely recommend for you to read the articles yourself and come to your own conclusions about it all. But now, that leaves just one question, and that question is... where are we now? Well, after the whole debacle of Homestuck 2 essentially being shut down, Hussey released a statement clearing the air about everything that had happened over the past few days. It reads as follows. Homestuck 2 is going to be completed, but the Patreon will not be charging patrons anymore. The account will be frozen and no additional patrons will be accepted, but the ones currently registered are welcome to stay and receive notifications about the future of this project if the team is inclined to post any. The plan is to now have Homestuck 2 finished, but without a regular update schedule. Previously saved Patreon funds will be used to privately commission the team to finish the story. It will all be posted at once when it is finished, and there will be no updates until this happens. I expect that it will take a long time to finish the story. This is because I am specifically instructing the team to work slowly. I originally agreed to let this project move forward based entirely on the presumption that it would be an enjoyable experience for the team involved. It's not like I had a burning need to release a continuation of the narrative or a formal sequel, which is never how I viewed this arc. This project had mostly come about because I picked up on the enthusiasm the original creative group had for the idea, and also I sensed that the energy was being reciprocated by the particular state of the fandom at the time. But since then, I've observed that it's been pretty far from an enjoyable experience for the team due to the way that members have been treated by large segments of the fandom, and this pattern appeared to surface almost immediately after the project launched. This has put me in a state of conflict about the project ever since, because I like the content quite a bit. Some have lamented that it doesn't feel much like the original series, but it was never supposed to. I've never once invited anyone to work on a Homestuck project with the hope that they will perfectly clone my style or approach to making content. I feel that is neither possible nor desirable. So at any time I invite anyone, the only real standard I want them to meet is to bring their own voice and perspective to the work, even if, or sometimes especially, this results in significant departures from the expectations for the characters fans typically have. Like pretty much everything else that's been released over the last few years, I think Homestuck 2 has satisfied that purpose very well. So there's been conflicts between liking what's being done, not wanting to waste the work or disappoint those who enjoy it, and the chronic abusive treatment the staff has received while trying to work on this story. I admit I've been at a loss on how to handle this, so I've just let it ride for a year or so. To some extent, it's part of any project like this to put stuff out there and receive criticism, and I'm sure the team understood that, but I think there's a line where criticism crosses over into more abusive expressions, and I've observed this has happened way too often. If it were just me making it, I don't think it would even occur to me to have a problem with it, because I'm so used to wild stuff coming at me for doing this for many years prior. I view attitudes towards me very differently than those I invite for collaboration. I've done this for so long, hostility towards me barely even registers. If I inexplicably log onto Tumblr appearing to resemble some sort of extravagant clown, make a few shitposts, and I'm met with literally thousands upon thousands of comments about feet, it's pretty easy to just laugh it off because that's exactly the type of stupid shit I expected to see. I've always just worked with those types of contentious interactions in a way that is inseparable from whatever strange performance is connected with the content I happen to be making at the time. But it's a very different situation when I see stuff directed at the people I work with. The things that I see my co-creators and friends have to read are a lot more alarming. One major problem here is the people I work with are mostly women, many are transgender, many are people of colour. So the stuff they get is especially vicious, because the people giving them shit usually target the sensitive features of their identities in ways that they don't with me. And I'm not just talking about obvious stuff like calling them slurs or anything. It's more that I've noticed people have clever ways of using people's identities to bully them in less conspicuously bigoted ways. They always go a little harder, a little more critical, manufacturing ways of blaming them for things they had nothing to do with. Stuff you start noticing when you've seen way too much of it. Much of this stuff even crosses into physically threatening territory. Some people I work with get multiple threats every week, and it's just become a routine part of their lives while being involved with Homestuck. All the above treatment I'm referring to is not focused on a couple of people. It covers everyone contributing to the full range of Homestuck projects over the last several years. And I don't think that's what contributors were signing up for, or at least I never wanted anyone who takes on official work to feel like it's an essential cost of participation. But I've never really known what to do about this, because it's very difficult to control fandom behaviour, and if you ever try to police anyone's conduct, it usually just backfires. The worst offenders out there see it as almost a challenge to go harder. So usually I leave these things alone, since the only alternative is pulling the plug on certain projects, which is essentially what I'm doing here, while taking steps to make sure it gets finished in the background, because I really don't want to see the work get wasted. My only criteria for the completion of Homestuck 2 is that whoever is involved the rest of the way has just a good time with it, and ends up feeling that they have made a good story. If the team is happy with it, then so am I, and nothing else about it matters to me, especially not sticking to a schedule or satisfying fandom demands, whatever those even are at this point. Since this is a post appearing on the Patreon, I should say any reference to abusive fan behaviour isn't including current patrons, obviously. I can only assume anyone willing to donate to the project for this long would hold a very sincere attitude about supporting this project, which I greatly appreciate, and I'm sure the Homestuck 2 team does as well. There's probably more to say about this, but I'll leave it at that for now. If there's anything to add later, I may address it in an internal note to patrons. Remember that if you want to remain a patron, you will never be charged again. I'll consider ways to thank the patrons for hanging in there all this time and supporting the team. Maybe some free stuff. We all appreciate your support. So, TLDR, Homestuck 2 is pretty much going to be on an indefinite hiatus, being slowly worked on in the background until it is complete, at which point it will be released all at once. Hussey never really had a desire or saw any real need to continue the narrative, and did so because it felt to him like both the original creative team and the fandom were in a position where a sequel seemed like the next logical step. However, the enthusiasm and the enjoyment started to slow down between the team when they received waves of targeted harassment from the fanbase. Torn between cancelling the project in its current state and not wanting everyone's hard work to go to waste, Hussey was stuck between a rock and a hard place before ultimately deciding to pull the plug and have Homestuck 2 be quietly worked on in the background, with the remaining Patreon money being used to fund it, and patrons no longer being charged for the project. And that's where we are. After hearing this news, some rejoiced at the fact, while others lamented the death of something that had potential. Personally, what do I think of all this? Well, in my opinion, I feel that this statement is a little flawed. From my perspective, it feels like it puts a lot of the blame squarely on the fanbase for Homestuck 2's demise. It comes very much across as Hussey seeing the fanbase as a petulant infant, wailing and screaming, and Hussey's just decided to put us to bed for the day because we've been bad and he's tired and old and he doesn't want to deal with us. That being said though, do I believe that the team behind this received harassment, especially harassment aimed at their gender, race or identity? Abso-fucking-lutely. There is no doubt in my mind that this happened. Homestuck is something that meant a lot to an incredibly large amount of people. People grew up with it, made friends through it, possibly met their former or current partners through it. It was something that was completely in a league of its own, something that no one could have seen succeeding in the way that it did. So when you take something that people love, and in their eyes distort it in such a way that resembles something completely different to what they knew, there are going to be people who will emotionally lash out, who will seek to hurt the people who did this, and for some people they will go for the low blows like gender and race. Is this a justification for these actions? Absolutely not. I would say it's more of an explanation. Regardless, I don't care how quote unquote terrible Homestuck 2 is, no one deserves to undergo horrendous comments like that, although I will admit that not all of these comments were malicious in nature, and some people were just offering constructive criticism, and to lump the entire fanbase together with those who did so is a little dismissive from my perspective. In any case, despite the fact that I've been ribbing the crew a little bit, both through my words and my tone in this video, for the sake of entertainment and some funny ha-has, I think it's important for everyone to understand that the team behind Homestuck 2 are people as well. A sequel to Homestuck was always going to be a tough act to follow, regardless of how non-canonical you claimed that it was. This was the closest thing to an official sequel, and I think that something like this was unavoidable. The team was always going to get hate to varying degrees. Anyone who's ever made anything with a modicum of popularity will tell you that appealing to all the people who enjoy what you make and trying your best to make something that all enjoy is a near Sisyphean task. There will always be someone out there who will hate your work. Hell, God himself could have descended from heaven and penned Homestuck 2, and there will still be people out there who think it's total shit. So even though I'm not a fan of it, I still appreciate their attempt at creating something that was a unique take on the world beyond the ending we were given. Homestuck is definitely not where it used to be. With Homestuck 2 pretty much bombing and fan interest nowhere near its highest highs, its future is looking pretty unclear. But who knows, maybe one day it will rise from the ashes and usher in a new age of Homestuck, one that will retake the internet by storm, like it did all those years ago.